Welcome everyone to the National Readout of Aged Out. Today, I'm so excited to have you all join us today as we're going to talk about a very important project that Think of Us did. Over the last year, we've worked with 5 different jurisdictions in Bloomwork to really understand the experiences of how we were failing young people who were aging out of the foster care system. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to Sarah Sullivan, and we'll kick off our readout from here.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Sixo. Welcome, everybody. It's such a pleasure to get to share this information with you. As Sixto mentioned, Think of Us started on a journey about a year ago now to understand what in the heck is child welfare missing for older foster youth, and particularly for youth who age out of care. Certainly, the system spends a lot of money and a lot of calories, and yet still somehow outcomes for young people who age out of care are poor, and many young people have, not the most positive experiences. So what were we missing? And we had the great pleasure to partner with 5 incredible sites across the United States between the fall of 2019 and the spring of 2020. And those places were the New York Foundling in New York City, Santa Clara County in California, Uplift Family Services in San Jose, First Place for Youth in 2 counties in California, and Hennepin County in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, in Minnesota. And we're so impressed by their willingness to go on this journey with us to find out what could we be doing better. And so we embarked on this discovery sprint with our partners, Bloom Works, a consultancy that helps government really transform and reimagine how it delivers services to folks. And with a team of about 5 of us, we went across the country to try to answer the question of what is child welfare missing for older foster youth. I just want to acknowledge my teammates, many of whom will be on the readout here today, but we're missing one of them, and that's Sixto Cancel, who you just met, myself, Sarah Sullivan, and Marina Nitza, who were made up the Think of Us side, and Sarah Fatala, Emily Wright Moore, and Lauren Lockwood, who were on the Bloomwork side, who did this project with us. Again, many of us you'll hear from today. Our big answer, to cut to the punchline of what we think the system is missing for older foster youth, are healing and dealing with trauma, centering youth in their preparedness, and helping youth build a supportive network of adults that'll be there during care and on the other side of care. So I'll explain a little bit about what's going to happen today in this meeting and how it'll work. First, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Emily, who is going to tell us about the methodology, methodology. And then, because it's nice to show and not tell, we will also have my colleague, Sarah F., actually lead us through a way for you to participate as a part of this readout. It's nice not to just be told, but to see. And human-centered design is newish to child welfare, we know, and so it can be fun to actually see what the heck we did. So Sarah Fatala is going to tee you up for how that's going to work in today's session, and it's absolutely totally optional. You can just sit and listen to the information, but if you want to participate, that's cool too. Then I'll walk us through the findings and recommendations, and we'll be broken down through those 3 big chapters. And at the end of each of those, trauma, preparedness, and relationships, then I'm going to let the rest of the research team, Emily, Sarah, and Sixto, kind of comment and reflect on their take on those 3 things too. After that, we're going to have a panel with folks with lived experience. Sixto is going to facilitate a panel with a couple of folks, one that was a part of the research sprint, and some others that are just hearing this information for the first time, just like you. After that, then we'll get to see some of the outcomes of this live demo, what you all have to say about these findings, and then that'll be it. So I'm going to just walk you through. You'll see that as we talk today, we really want to center the stories of people that we spoke to, and so you'll see quotes throughout this presentation that came directly from the research we did. And just to be clear, this is not a academic, peer-reviewed paper in the traditional sense that we often hear about in child welfare. This is more of a user-centered design, human-centered design sprint, which takes a lot of the kind of best practices in the technology sector and increasingly other sectors using tools like this to kind of rapidly understand what is going on the ground. And so as a part of this project, we spoke to over 200 young people, staff, supportive adults in 92 interviews and workshops. And this was to get the real ground truth of how are young people and staff talking about the experience of aging out and what are their thoughts and feelings to how this works. So you'll see those quotes grounded in the conversation here. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Emily Wright-Moore from Bloomworks.
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm excited to be able to share this work with all of you. I want to talk a little bit about how we got to the point of doing the work and how we approached it when we did it. So when Think of Us originally came to us with their question, which is, how do we understand the lived experiences of older youth in foster care? And then on top of that, how do we identify opportunities that will improve the process? We were just really interested in doing this work together and understanding what life was like and how this process worked. It's definitely a complicated service design delivery problem in our eyes, and one that we wanted to dive deeper into. So we started out by spending a few days together understanding the problem, understanding what solutions have been tried, understanding the things that we didn't know and needed to ask. And then from there, after we generated questions that we wanted to ask, we went out to 5 different locations across the country and spent time there. When we were there, we talked to foster youth, we talked to their care teams, we talked to their other support people that were unpaid. And in general, we tried to keep different scenarios where they could be more or less comfortable, more comfortable, where we could get a better sense of what their life was like and what the process had been like for them. So we had workshops with groups of youth at one time, and we also talked to people one-on-one. We also talked to teams, like care teams at the same time or individually, and we asked them questions just about their job, about the pain points, if they had a magic wand, what would they improve, sort of questions. When we worked with the youth, I think it was really important to all of us that we approach this interaction with a great deal of care and respect, and not come in and just ask a bunch of questions and then leave and ask anyone to relive their trauma with us or anything like that. We wanted to be respectful. We had first we decided to compensate any youth or anyone we talked to that this wasn't part of their daily job. We compensated with cash. We also spent a lot of time going through the consent forms with them and explaining that if at any point they wanted to leave or no longer participate, or there was a question that they didn't want to answer, that was totally okay. We worked hard to make sure it was a respectful space and one that they felt comfortable, and like at the end they'd been charged up rather than depleted. We brought pizza and we had snacks. We had lots of paper and ways to color and draw things together. We wanted to get a sense for what their aging out process could look like to them. So we asked them to map it out for us. These drawings in that last slide and this one as well, are them drawing their support network and what they think their community looks like and the people that they trust and turn to for help. We got a wide variety of responses, and they were all really, really informative for us in understanding like what the sort of the support system that they had in place and what they perceived to have in place as well. We then continued on to ask them about their hopes and fears for aging out, and then even went so far as to have them draw an app that they thought would help them with aging out. This is not so we could just use these designs for apps, but it was actually a good way to get information about what they thought would actually be useful in like a day-to-day sense rather than in a bigger, loftier sense. So after, our over 200 people that we talked to, we brought all of this back to that same original spot that we had met, and we hung out in a very small room with 1,000, must have been thousands of tiny pieces of paper, all of which had things that we had heard that made an impact on us. Quotes, findings, things we learned, like facts that we uncovered, differences between different programs in different places of the country. And we grouped them into areas where we could sort of assign them themes, and then from there come out with insights that we learned in our various journeys. So this was this is always kind of a messy process, but it's always incredibly impactful. And at the end of it, you come away realizing how much you really did learn. So from there, after this, we went back and we pulled all of this into the reports that you can find online today, and we worked to make sure that this was something that represented the experience that we'd had, with recommendations as well as with insights. And I think that is the end of my part of these slides, and I think I'm handing it over to Sarah Fatala. Let me know if I gotten that wrong.
No, you're absolutely right, Emily. Thank you so much. And I'll have Sixto, if you can share the Miro board so I can show how we're going to take some of these participatory aspects that we used during our discovery sprint, where we had workshops, where we had co-creative activities with our participants, with youth, with staff, and other people involved in the child welfare system. And that's how we like to engage with community. That's how we like to center lived experience. We don't want to be sort of on our own in our little ivory tower and doing things and then sort of reflecting them back on the world. We like to have as much interaction and engagement as possible throughout the stages of our research and design of our programs and of our priorities. So what you see here on the screen is something that we call it's a Miro board. It's a digital canvas, basically. If you are on the Think of Us //live page, there's a link to it that says under the video that says click here to participate in the live synthesis. And this is where you'll find yourself. I can see that there's already a bunch of you here as I'm seeing all of your cursors that I'm hiding for right now. But what we would love for you to do, as my colleague Sarah Sullivan after this will start sharing the findings and recommendations from the research, is to just give your reactions and your feedback as to what you're hearing. So what you'll see is that we have a number of boards, each one with our themes. So these will be the findings. And then you'll see that you'll have the finding up top and sometimes some accompanying quotes. And then what we would love for you to do is, if you find it that this thing that you've heard is surprising, what is completely new to you, to just grab a dot and sort of pull it where you're agreeing with it. Sorry, and I'm trying to get to a point where I can show you how you drag the dot. And if this is something that feels compelling to you and you want to tell us how it relates to your own experience, you can go on one of these stickies and just say, I agree with this, or I disagree with this, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll have that for every single one of the findings. And then when we get to the recommendations, it's very similar, where you will see that we have some recommendations. If you think that this is a recommendation that is important, you take a dot and you drag it under it. And if you have a comment or some inspiration or some feedback on it, you can leave it on the sticky notes. So if in any case you cannot use Miro for whatever reason, what I would ask you to do is to leave a +1 in the chat so that we can do the dot for you. And you can also leave your comments in the chat, and then we will input them here for you. And again, I just want you to know that the link is, if you go to the website thinkofus.org/live, you will see that this is where you can tune in for the live, and the link for it is right here. Click here to participate in the live synthesis. So if you click on this, you can join us on the Miro board. And with that, I will pass it on to Sarah so that she can get to the meat and potatoes of our research.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Sarah. And I'll let us pull our slides back up. So we thought it would be fun to, again, kind of show you, instead of only tell you, what it looked like to do this work together. So what I'm going to do now is walk you through the 3 big pillars that we uncovered as a part of this work. As I mentioned, these are healing and dealing with trauma, letting youth be the center of their preparedness, and then helping youth build a network of supportive adults. So I'm going to go through each of these one at a time. I'm going to share some of our findings, some of our anecdotes, and then I'm going to share our recommendations for how, as an ecosystem, we can do better on these things. And then after the end of each one, I'm going to pull in some of my colleagues, Emily, Sarah at Sixto, and let them share any of their reflections on what they learned as a part of this topic on those issues. Okay, so let's jump right in. And as Sarah mentioned, while I'm doing this, you have the option to be using the Miro board and sharing your reflections in real time. But again, that's totally optional. You can also just listen this way. Okay, so first, healing and dealing with trauma. We really took away that what we now believe is the elephant in the room in child welfare. The thing that we are really failing to address is the trauma that many foster youth have experienced. We all somehow know this, and yet we're not oriented toward really acknowledging it or addressing or helping youth heal from this trauma. So this was one of the really big aha moments for us during this work. And first, I just want to root us in some of the reflections and quotations that we heard from staff and youth on this subject. So I'm just going to give you a minute to read these quotes as I pass through. There's about 3 or 4 for each topic. So you can see this one says, being taken away from your family is always an enormous trauma. Here's someone saying, my mom died of a heart attack at 32. She had cancer before that. She was like sick, really sick. After that, my great-grandmother died, and my brother and sister were removed from my dad's house. Another that says, I wish the system tapped into finding me long-term healthy relationships, not being a pill-pushing system, but teaching me yoga, meditation. And then we need to start addressing the trauma and grief the very first day youth enter care. So this is a presentation about our Aged Out report, which you can find online at the Think of Us website. That has lots and lots of findings for each of these 3 pillars, but I'm just going to walk you through a handful of each of these findings, some of the ones that we find most compelling and that we want to highlight with you today. One is that 100% of foster youth have experienced trauma just because the removal from the family is a trauma. Now, many young people have experienced more trauma than just that, abuse or neglect that may have been the impetus for entering care in the first place. But regardless, all youth have experienced the removal from home. And what we found is that the system, even though this is a routine thing that the system does day in and day out, of course, is these removals, that for an individual, for a young person, the removal from the family is a very significant life event. So it's very significant to young people, but not significant in the life of the system, which does this day in and day out. So first, we really want to draw people's attention to the fact that the removal from the family is a big deal. And also recognize that we don't really have a vocabulary to really talk about this specific kind of trauma. Other folks have talked about how the the particular traumas and losses within child welfare are likened to ambiguous losses, which are kinds of losses that are not well defined and not well scoped. One poignant quote from this research says, you know, we don't have a word for this. We know when someone dies, you say, I'm sorry for your loss, and you attend their funeral. What do you say when, you know, how do you say, I'm sorry you got removed from your family and you don't know if you'll go back? And what we find is because the loss of foster care is so ambiguous, again, you get removed and you think it might just be a few days, you think it might be a few weeks, then you realize you may never be going home, then you're moving from foster home to foster home. Eventually, for older youth, they may find that they age out of care. All of this is obviously very ambiguous, and we notice that lacking a shared vocabulary to talk about these losses is actually can result in us not talking about them at all. And silence can actually be, you know, the worst thing to do when it comes to addressing loss. That silence can be, you know, the most painful thing. Then there is young people in the foster care system experience additional traumas. So once all youth face the trauma upon entry into care, but once you're in care, young people face additional traumas. Now, obviously, this can be egregious kind of traumas, which we have heard as a part of our work, which can include sexual abuse or racism or involvement with sex trafficking, the really, you know, really big abuses and traumas. And it can also include the everyday traumatic experiences of moving from home to home with no notice, not knowing if anybody cares about you or if the system cares about you, or having to move schools right after you got settled. And this additional trauma is impacting this population. We also found, and were surprised in some ways, that, you know, the system knows about some of the traumas I just mentioned, moving from school to school, moving from home to home. But what we found is that many young people had actually additional non-system traumas that the system may not have even known about. For example, we encountered a number of young people who had people in their social network die or pass away, oftentimes due to chronic illness at a premature age. And these were additional traumas and burden and grief that young people were carrying that actually didn't have anything to do with the system, so to speak, but was absolutely layering their experience and layering how they were showing up in the world. Then the system isn't set up to provide a safe, stable environment that's needed for healing. Okay, so we have young people that have experienced this trauma, but then now that they're in the system itself is not providing a safe environment or a stable environment often for healing. You know, stability, of course, you think about moving from home to home. But another one we found is that many young people that we talked to, especially in those youth workshops, would talk to us about how there was really no place for them to just feel sad and express their emotions. Obviously, if challenging or bad things have happened to you, it's normal that you might feel sad about it. And some young people told us that it's really triggering to, when you tell your staff member, the social worker, that you feel sad, that the first thing that you're met with is the suicide hotline. Or that someone else told us that not every time I feel sad do I need to be hospitalized. And finding that because the system can be so, you know, reactionary and have such a high concern about what could happen, that we actually just fail to meet the most basic needs of young people, which is like letting them express their emotions, which is probably the primal and the primary environment needed to have a path toward healing. We also found that young people really need opportunities to grieve and other pathways to developing their emotional well-being. But we were really struck by this thirst for opportunities to grieve on our very first morning, on our very first day of this research. The first place that we went to was Santa Clara County in California. And we walk in on the first day to what is known as the Hub, a place where young people can go and access a whole bunch of services, but also hang out there. And it was the first morning on the first day. It was a couple days into November in 2019. And we walk into this beautiful altar on one of the walls, and, you know, we asked about it. And they explained to us that it was a Dia de los Muertos altar, and that it was a tradition that this hub had started doing a few years ago, which was to recognize together Dia de los Muertos. And they said the reason they did that is because a few years ago, they had lost a former foster youth in their community, and the staff wanted to have a way to help young people address and process the loss of that foster youth. And it was nearing October, and they were looking for a way to address it. And someone said, well, this is kind of what Dia de los Muertos is for. We could use that Mexican holiday tradition as a way to commemorate somebody who we've lost. And about 70% of the youth in that county are Hispanic. And they said, yes, let's do that. That sounds good. And interestingly, so they set up this altar with the intention of providing a space for youth to come around and reflect on and grieve the loss of this former foster youth. Interestingly, when they did that, foster youth very quickly used this altar in this moment as an opportunity to actually grieve and address other losses in their life. So not just this one foster youth, but actually foster parents and bio family members and even siblings that they had lost, that they hadn't had a chance to grieve. And so instead of just this one loss, people said, we got a lot of grief to offer to this table. And the staff were so moved and overwhelmed by what they saw, that this became an annual tradition, where now what they do is they open the altar each year with a grief counselor comes in, and young people are invited to put a flower, I think it is, on the altar and in memory of someone or something that they are grieving. And the grief counselor leads them through a ritual that day. And then it's kept up the altar for several weeks. And so for young people who don't want to participate on that day, they can do it throughout it. And likewise, there's a closing ceremony at the end where the counselor comes back in. And we were basically so moved by this beautiful display and how staff, very quickly addressed a need, kind of almost stumbled on a need in their community to help young people have a place to grieve, that we were really struck by how the system doesn't provide, that the staff had to create an ad hoc opportunity to do this, but lots of other locations might be missing this opportunity to have young people have a safe place to grieve and process things that have happened. Also, the system relies heavily on medicating the symptoms of trauma with psychotropic medications and doesn't focus as much on addressing and healing the root causes of trauma or even preventing additional trauma. We found that despite what seems like very obvious and overwhelming amounts of trauma amongst young people, that the pathways to healing were pretty scarce. When we would talk to young people about this, the system pretty much only offered them psychotropic medication and sometimes talk therapy. But what we found is that with this complex of an issue and with so many different layers, that really young people were thirsty for more pathways to healing. And actually, without the system offering more pathways to healing, youth will on their own often stumble on coping mechanisms and healing mechanisms that work for them. And we've heard a wide range of these things, from meditation to using food as medicine to exercising. Someone takes hot showers. People are part of communities online, like music communities and anime communities, all of which help them to heal and address some of the trauma that they were facing. One story that comes to mind to me on this as well is a young man who we met who was on a number of psychotropic medications and was coming off of them and experienced really intense withdrawal symptoms, which he said impacted him in basically all possible ways: socially, emotionally, behaviorally, physically, he said, for 4 months. But to manage those withdrawal symptoms, he got into healthy eating, and healthy eating actually helped him manage the effects of the withdrawal symptoms from the medication until they ultimately passed within a couple of months. So that's some of what we heard. Next, I'm going to move us to what we think some of our recommendations are. So the first is to acknowledge system-induced trauma. Now, we tend to focus on how trauma that happened before care, either within a family or whatnot, that might have led to care. But we often fail to acknowledge the trauma that happens because of the system. And as I mentioned, this can include the kind of egregious kinds of trauma, but it can also include the everyday kinds of trauma of just after you get close with your counselor, they leave and you have to tell your story all over again, or moving high schools your senior year, or moving from foster home to foster home, or something as simple as your social worker meeting you after school one day to say you're moving your foster care placement without ever you getting a chance to have a say in where you're placed, or to even talk to your foster care parents about why you're being moved. And we really want to acknowledge the ways that the system induces trauma so that we can actually work to mitigate those and reduce the amount of trauma that young people are in care impacted by. The second is to center youth healing in care. So, the system tends to, especially for older youth, focus on the big three: employment, education, and housing. And no doubt, all of those are critical basic needs. But what we suspect is that underlying even those basic needs are more primal needs, like knowing if anyone loves you, and feeling well in your body and feeling well emotionally. And we think that youth healing from trauma should actually be something that we center in care, just like we center employment and education, that it is equally important, if not more important, in the long run, is helping young people feel well and whole. The next is developing a vocabulary for talking about ambiguous loss. Like, we know that we don't address some of this trauma in child welfare specifically because we don't have the words for it. So how do we find a way to meaningfully talk about the ambiguous loss that young people are facing so that it doesn't go unaddressed and doesn't go silenced, which can be the worst response? Next is to develop a diverse set of tools to support youth healing. As we mentioned, when you talk to young people, they will typically say that the tools that they are offered are psychiatric tools like medication or talk therapy. But many young people we talked to didn't feel like those adequately addressed their needs. As far as medication goes, we spoke to a lot of young people who felt like they had been wrongly diagnosed, that they were put on medication because no one wanted to deal with their emotions, that they weren't supported in the coming on or coming off of drugs. Likewise with talk therapy, many young people felt like the movement from counselor to counselor to counselor, having to retell their story over and over again, was really disheartening, and in some cases made them disinterested in talk therapy altogether. Regardless, even when those two paths are very useful for somebody, regardless, with such a complex situation, clearly we need multiple paths and many, many paths to help heal from trauma. And leading trauma experts and doctors right now are actually looking to a wide set of tools for these for healing trauma anyway. So that's consistent with what the literature is moving toward anyway. The next is engaging youth as the expert in their healing. So if we center healing in foster care, which we think we should, healing cannot be one more way that youth are disempowered. This cannot be a checkbox on an ILP plan that says, have you healed? That's another thing that we're reporting up to the judge that a youth could fail at. This needs to be an empowering experience where the young person really gets to take the lead and be at the forefront of their journey. And there's lots of different ways to think about healing from trauma. One of the ways to think about it is that healing from trauma is the restoration of agency. That trauma happened in one way or another because agency was taken away from someone, and that the way to reverse that is to restore agency. It's not the only way to think about how to heal trauma, but it is a way. And if we think about it that way, then giving youth agency in this process will be critical to helping them actually overcome it. So let's let them be the experts on this journey. And then last is creating a culture of healing in foster care. So we think one of the ways that we can really empower youth is to actually lift up and celebrate the stories of foster youth and former foster youth who have overcome impossible odds and have lived beautiful, beautiful stories that they can share with the community. This doesn't negate the harm that was done to them or the harm that may have happened by the system or other people. It just centers what is possible in these stories and can help other foster youth know what worked for other people and how they might get to the other side too. I'll share when Emily Wright-Moore walked us through the three documents that we would have youth do in the workshop, and one of them was designing an app. And that's because Think of Us has been working on technology for a long time, and we said, well, why don't we just ask young people how they would design an app for aging out? And interestingly, many of the features that young people put on their app were healing modalities, help with sleep, help with meditation, connecting to a community, things like this that were not necessarily what you would expect for them to think, but they have a real thirst for ways to heal. And so let's center those ideas in the work as we center healing in care. So with that, I'm going to invite my colleagues on to just reflect on any additions they have that I may have left off or that really stood out to them in this. So please welcome Emily or Sarah F. and Sixto. Please share anything that you want to share. Sixto may also share the kind of significance of some of this in child welfare.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for that. One of the things that really stood out for me when we were doing this work is that we looked at certain bureaucratic touch points and we asked the question, where do we see healing besides medication and talk therapy show up, right? And folks on the research team pointed out, well, there's so much that's in the independent living plan. There's so much that's in the transition independent living plan. Where does healing actually show up? Why isn't it a named goal? And yet I believe that part of the system's responsibility is to make sure that every young person is healing, developing, and that they're truly positioned to thrive. That is the promise that we made when we removed young people from their home. But I'll pass it to Emily and Sarah F. To see some of your insights.
I can chime in. I think one of the things that seems so surprising to me when we're talking about healing and dealing with trauma is that one of the core tenets of being trauma informed is really building relationships in the form of partnerships and sort of having reciprocal relationships and really making sure that you're bringing back control over what is otherwise loss of control. And that's such a simple principle to carry throughout everything that the system has to offer youth, whether that's, if you're feeling sad, what do you want to do about it? Do you just want to feel sad, or do you why is the immediate response the suicide hotline or something else? If you want to see a therapist, do you have a preference around what kind of therapist do you want to see, or what kind of therapy do you want to engage in? It seems so simple, and yet it's not something that the system really spends a lot of effort sort of shifting how it engages with youth around.
Thank you for that. I'll pile on there. I think one thing that shocked me was it surprised me, because I think when we think about ways to do this, ways to give someone agency, we think about big things, and we think about big shifts in processes or systems. And one person was like, I don't know, I don't really like cats, or I don't like dogs. I like cats, but I keep getting put in these houses with dogs, and I'm a cat person. And just having this moment of that's a pretty strong preference to have. Just everybody a lot of people have that preference, and the fact that it's never really asked or considered. I think there's even things that would be somewhat small to consider, or at least ask, that would make a huge difference in someone's agency over themselves and how they fit into their environment. And so I was surprised at the amount that there are small things that could be done that would really, really account for what seems like a loss of control in a big sense, but the small things would make it seem smaller.
Really appreciate that. And just to, I'm really happy we're seeing in the chat here, folks who are watching directly from YouTube Live, that they're resonating with that, and that they're talking about, the focus on healing is such a big need. So if you're on YouTube Live, you can engage with us and you can chat stuff in there and be able to see what folks have to say about this.
Beautiful, thank you. Okay, let's move on to the next chapter.
Awesome.
Which is around centering youth and their preparedness. And I'll also just add, yes, of course, keep sharing your comments in the chat. And also, if you see the link to the Miro board, you're invited to share any of your comments directly in the Miro board so we can capture feedback in real time. But again, that part is totally optional. Beautiful. Second thing that we were really focused on is centering youth in their preparedness. Now, you may think it's weird or funny that we might say a big missing gap in child welfare is preparedness, because for older foster youth, the system spends a lot of its calories and a lot of its attention focused on preparedness, which means, what's going to happen after you age out of care, employment, housing, education. We don't disagree. When we saw the 5 site partners across the country, every site partner had programs and strategies that it had around preparedness. But the distinction that we're making is that we found it to be often system-defined preparedness rather than youth-defined preparedness. And so what we think is a big missing link here is youth-defined preparedness. So I'm going to walk you through some of what that means to us. But first, I want to ground you again in some of the quotations from people we spoke with. There are about 4 for this section. So this is a foster youth who said, "Whenever I talk to caseworkers, I feel like they're trying to extract information from me so they can write their report." A staff who said, "Whether a young person got their needs met was largely a roulette wheel. It was all on the minor themselves in terms of accessing services." Another paid staff who said, "We're serving more of the court's purposes than the youth's purposes." And a case manager who said, "We spend more time managing crises than we would like, so that purposely sitting down and working on your goals and making steps toward them can be hard when you're just trying to save the kid's placement all the time." Again, the full list of findings about this chapter you can find on our Aged Out report, which lives on the Think of Us website. But I'm going to highlight again some of what we think are the top takeaways about centering youth in their preparedness. The first is that the system doesn't do a great job of helping youth understand the timeline and path for aging out. So I'll give you one very clear example about this. And that was, we were with a site partner in the state of California, and we would talk to staff about when foster care ends or when extended foster care ends. And staff would tell us it's 21. And we would talk to foster youth and say, "When does foster care end?" And they would say 21. But then by accident, we ended up figuring out that, and when we dug a little further, that when foster youth said 21, many actually thought it meant through 21, which is to say 22, as opposed to until 21, which is the end of 20. So even though foster youth and staff were saying the same words, they had a meaning that was an entire calendar year apart. And we took this as a pretty important insight that despite the system's best intentions, they had made sure that foster youth knew that care ended at 21. Despite the best intentions, the literal meaning of the words got lost in translation. So that made us wonder, what else is being lost in translation when we define terms from the system's perspective rather than young people's perspective? And how can we do a better job of making sure the terms we use and the timeline and the path that we're talking about is not only translated to youth, but actually defined by youth, where they can be telling us what they mean and what they want, and then we can adapt our vocabulary to that. The next is that young people's priorities for aging out of care don't always overlap and are often different than the system's priorities. So I'll give you an example, and this is really a beautiful example of something that Hennepin County in Minneapolis, Minnesota is doing. They have something called the Youth Transition Conference. And this is an optional conference that foster youth who will age out of care can participate in. It's not mandatory, and it's meant to be really empowering. Young people get to decide if they want one, what the meeting will be about, who gets to go, and if they want to have it multiple times or just one time. And the idea is that this is a youth-led conference that they can use to help prepare for aging out of foster care. And when we talk to the staff that run this program, I asked them, what kinds of topics do foster youth tend to make these conferences around? And one of the staff said, it's often really surprising and not what you would think. For us, we might assume that it's around housing or education. And she said, but we've actually had a number of foster youth who've used their YTC, Youth Transition Conference meetings, to help discuss transitioning genders or navigating gender identities, or other people who've used it to navigate a relationship with a bio parent or bio family member. What we really took from this, and it's a really beautiful practice that Hennepin County uses, what we took from this is that the systems goals and youth goals for aging out can often be very different. And very often we have a prescriptive list of goals that we ask youth to think about, like housing and employment. But we really need to offer open-ended opportunities for youth to tell us what they care about. And if we never give them the chance to actually tell us what they care about, we may never even know that we're letting them age out of care without having addressed something that's very, very important to them. Bio families is a great example. The system often goes out of its way to not acknowledge any relationship with bio parents, except we all know, and the research indicates, that often when youth age out of care, they will reconnect with bio parents. And if that's a goal for young people, how can we help best position them to meet their goals on the other side of care, whether or not we like what their goal is? The next part is these priorities, which is youth priorities, can go unrecognized and unsupported, making it difficult for youth to prepare for life on the other side. So even when staff may know what a young person's goal is, we don't always do a good job of helping them break down that goal into steps so that we can help them actually achieve it. And the next is youth in foster care do have ambitions for the future, but they're often left on their own to figure out how to make that future a reality. One of the exercises that we did as a part of the youth workshop that Emily showed you some pictures of was to ask young people to write out their hopes and their dreams for aging out of care. What were they hopeful for, and what were their hopes and their fears? What were their hopes for aging out of care, and what were their fears? And young people expressed having the most extraordinary dreams. People wanted to be successful. People wanted to have a happy family, all sorts of, normal, beautiful life goals. And it's clear that the system doesn't always have a way to actually acknowledge these goals and help young people meet them. And then a lot of times you hear staff kind of with the idea that maybe young people in care don't have big dreams. But what we think is that's not true. We might just not be finding a way to really surface those dreams and help youth meet them. Okay, I'm going to move to some of our recommendations on this. The first is very simply define preparedness in youth's voice. Let's make sure we know, that young people define the most basic terms of preparedness, like through 21, until 21, that they know what those things mean, but also that the concept of preparedness in general is defined by youth. And this is at the systemic level, meaning let's make sure that youth are helping to define what preparedness means at a system level, but it also means at the individual level. Each young person is going to have different goals and a perspective around aging out of care. Let's help that individual person shape and define what preparedness means to them. Next is set youth-centered goals for transition. This can go to the point I made before of actually asking open-ended questions of what are your goals for transition, or what is the most important thing in your life and how can we help you achieve that. But it also goes down to making sure we're asking them open-ended questions about even the basics. So the system will always, I'm sure, focus on employment, education, and housing. But how can we make sure that even within those three things, we're surfacing youth-specific goals around housing? We often find that young people, because housing was such a disruptive part of growing up in foster care, that many youth have really specific goals around where they want to live. And how can we help surface those goals and do our best to help them meet them? And then last is help foster youth plan out how we'll meet these goals. So how do we actually break down these goals into bite-sized chunks and help youth meet these goals as they get ready to transition out of care? Okay, so I'll pause for a moment and invite my colleagues back, Sarah, Emily, and Sixto, to see if you have reflections on what you took away from centering youth in their preparedness. And Sixto, what you think this means for child welfare?
You know, I think one of the things that really stuck out to me was when we did meet that young man who, you know, was like, oh yeah, I age out in a couple of weeks from now. And he was sharing how he was so lost at the fact that he thought it was through 21, not up until 21. And when I think about the things that he shared with us, it wasn't just about the miscommunication, but it's been about the entire journey where he had a set of ideas and principles of what he thought preparation looked like. And that just wasn't true for what the system had defined as preparation, right? And so for me, when I think about Chafee right now and this new opportunity of $400 million to redesign the way that young people prepare to age out, I think that this is an opportunity to start centering some of the principles that we just heard around youth being able to define what they believe are their own preparedness, but also the preparedness that alumni with lived experience in foster care can say, here's what we've learned. We've been through this. And so here's what we can share and start to really center the lived experience and how is it that we actually shape and reshape this process, because it's up for grabs, basically, in my opinion, right now. So I'll pass it over to Emily, Sarah. Any thoughts, questions?
I can chime in here. I think one of the things that felt very that still stuck out in my mind in like the conversations that we've had with youth day in and day out is how similar a lot of them had the dreams that they had for their lives were very much the ones that were modeled to them while they were in the system. So for example, a lot of the jobs that they wanted to do were some of the jobs that they encountered. So they wanted to work in social work, they wanted to work in law enforcement, they wanted to work in those professions that they had gotten the experience to interact with and witness. And I think that the system does a lot of youth a disservice in not necessarily expanding their imaginative capacity around what could be for their future, and that it's not just, okay, we need you to not be homeless and we need you to fulfill your basic needs, but be able to dream as big as they want to.
Yeah, I think it was interesting to see, you have a counselor or a case manager, and they work with foster youth all the time. And then you have foster youth who are interacting with other youth. And so I think it can be more surprising, I think, to someone new to it, those how the dreams are shaped by what they see. And I think it's been amazing to see how resilient people are for going after the things that they want. But I think it takes a lot to kind of break the bubble that we have for them so that they can start to see bigger than what's there and start to see what's out there. Some of the programs we saw, particularly in, I think, the Bay Area, that paired youth with people doing other types of jobs seemed really successful. I think that the friction for keeping those programs running was huge for the the social workers and the people that had to support them. But the benefit to youth was so apparent to us. So I think one area around recommendations to look into is how do we reduce the friction for more exposure to programs that they aren't normally seeing. So that was a promising thing to see, but also I think it'd be really exciting to see us move in a direction to where those are more accessible and easier to support for the staff so that the youth have better access.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that. I'll pass it now back to Sarah.
Beautiful, thank you all. And I'll let the slides come back up when you're ready. The last pillar we're gonna look at and that really, really stood out to us was helping youth build a network of supportive adults. Now, this is a topic that Think of Us has actually been interested in for a long time. And yet throughout this discovery, we learned some pretty surprising findings, or we were surprised by what we saw. First, I'm gonna go ahead and, like before, ground us in some of the words of people that we spoke to along the way. So this is someone from that youth transition conference I mentioned that says, I don't think the system helps preserve relationships. A lot of time, youth come into the system with more relationships than they leave with. Here's another who said, for the majority of our kids' lives, if they're aging out of care at 21, most people who have supported them have been paid to be in their life. And that includes parents, as in foster parents. So when no one's getting paid anymore, what support exists? And a program manager who said, part of intake is to ask young people to identify how many support people they have. On a good day, it's 3 people. It's only after you know them and talk to them that you get to see the support people. Hey, it sounds like that person you're talking about might be a support person. And then last, I could see why the adolescent wants to protect their supportive adult relationship. Who wants to walk into a room where you're getting judged? So I'm going to share some of our findings around helping youth build supportive networks of relationships. And again, the full list of findings for this topic is on our website under our Aged Out report. But I'm going to highlight what we think are some of the biggest takeaways in this section here. So what we learned, the system focuses on directly meeting the needs of foster youth. And this can actually block opportunities for other caring adults to step in or create the mental model where the system must meet the needs rather than having other people step in. So what do I mean? When a foster youth comes into care, the system steps in and says, we're gonna help you meet your needs during the time that you're in care. And while that has the fullest best intent, even in a world where that works perfectly and the system is able to fully meet the needs of a foster youth while they're in care, of course, those paid relationships end by definition at the moment a young person ends care. And we've heard stories of many foster youth who do develop meaningful relationships with paid staff, only to be disheartened on the other side of care to realize that those relationships don't exist in the same way anymore once they age out. Now, through no fault of staff members, they as soon as people age out on their caseload, new ones come in and they only have so much time in the day. So this model of having paid staff meet all of the needs of young people during time in care can actually mean that some relationships while youth are in care can atrophy, or we're not further strengthening and supporting youth in creating their own communities of support that can help them both while they're in care and then critically when they're out of care, and will be relying on unpaid supportive people in their life to help them meet their needs and have fulfilling lives. A big takeaway we had from this is that foster youth do have unpaid supportive people in their lives. Now, we have found that it's a big kind of myth, if you will, within the system that foster youth just don't have supportive people in their lives. They just don't have rich communities that they're a part of. And we found that to not be true. One of the ways that we did that was by doing the exercise that Emily showed you about in the methodology section, where we would ask young people to draw out a map, take out a piece of paper, and draw the people in their lives. What we found is, interestingly, when you talk to young people, if you say, tell me about the supportive people in your life, who's your support people? You will often hear them say, you'll get crickets. What we found is that we had to ask the question in a different way. So we started asking them to complete these network maps, and all youth had multiple people on their network maps. And they also had complex ways that they organized and made sense of these relationships, who they would go to for help, who they would go to for support, who they would go to for advice. And they had sophisticated ways that they made sense of all those relationships. We also learned to ask the question in a different way by saying, if you said, who's the support person in your life, you might get crickets. But if you say, if you got sick at school one day, who would pick you up? Or if you needed a ride to a job interview, who would take you? And then we'd start to get answers, and we'd ask when we'd pull on those threads. So we found that young people do have supportive people in their lives. But the big takeaway from us is that staff were often unaware of these outside relationships, that there is a big delta between the supportive relationships young people have and what staff know about these relationships. And this is because oftentimes young people will intentionally protect their supportive relationships from the system. And they have a lot of good and interesting reasons why they might do this. Some include foster youth are maintaining relationships with people that they're not supposed to be having relationships with, like bio family members. And of course, they wouldn't want to tell the system that they're maintaining those relationships because they're not supposed to. Other times, young people don't want to expose their relationships to the system because they feel like anytime someone gets exposed to the system, something bad happens. And this is one relationship that's going well, and they just don't want other people and the staff to know about it. And other times it's to protect their image or protect information, that they're nervous that if they bring a support person into the system, somehow the support person will find out that maybe the young person isn't doing well in school, or maybe they got into trouble, or some other piece of information that they want to keep private about themselves that they don't feel like they can necessarily control if they expose a relationship to the system. And other times it's the support people themselves who don't want to interface with the system. This can include maybe an aunt or an uncle or a friend who is also a parent of their own children, and they have the belief that if their family gets exposed to the system, something might happen to their own children. And so we hear sometimes of cases where someone in the young person's network might be willing to foster or provide a kinship placement, but they're nervous that more scrutiny by the system will actually hurt their own family. So we found lots of good reasons and understandable reasons that young people will intentionally protect their relationships from the system, and see how this creates a kind of delta between what the system knows and what is actually going on. I remember one really striking example was with a staff who said, I've unfortunately been to a few funerals for foster youth or former foster youth. And she says, when I go to the funerals, I know these young people, I've worked with these young people, I've known all about their lives. And for a few of them that have passed, I've gone to their funerals. And she said, I really expected to not see many other people there because I knew these young people's networks, and I knew that they didn't have that many support people in their lives. And she said, only to go and find out that there were lots of people there, including people that were in the young person's life when they were alive, and many, including support, even family members. And she thought, how did I not know that the young people had these support relationships, all the time? And how was there this big delta between what I knew and what was actually happening? And I'll just share another interesting anecdote about a young woman who was probably 15, and she had a sister, and she had a close girlfriend and a close friend, and this young woman was put into a group home. And on her very first night in the group home, she was FaceTiming with her friend, the other teenager, and the teenager on the other side's mom walked by and saw the screen, and she said into the screen to the woman in the group home, the young woman in the group home, "Where are you?" And she said, "Oh, well, me and my sister just got placed in a group home." And that mom, the mom of her friend, that was how she found out where her daughter's friend was living. And because of that, she said, well, if it was my kid in a group home, I would want someone to step in and help. And so that mom actually stepped up and offered to host both the young woman and her sister in providing a place to live. And it actually got them out of the group home. And the woman was a single mom with 3 children of her own, and it grew her family to 5. But she was more than happy to step in and help provide a place for her friend, her daughter's friend to live. But she literally would have had no way of knowing what was even going on had she not have walked by the phone at that opportune moment. So it's just a reminder that, you know, supportive people can play a really critical role in the well-being and the placement and all of this for young people, but we're going to have to know and let support people in on what is going on so they can actually step in and be helpful. So I'm going to walk through some of the recommendations for this one. And, you know, the first one is to really work with young people to map their supportive networks. Now, the first step is going to be having to build trust with young people for all the reasons that I just mentioned. Young people have good reasons why they're not exposing all of their relationships to the system. But first, we need to work by setting the expectation that support people will be a part of your experience and should be a part of your life. And so a first thing we can do is actually help young people think about who is in their life and how can we make a plan to strengthen these relationships during the time in care rather than weaken them. And one of the quotes that really kind of haunts me is one that was on the page earlier that said, sometimes youth enter care with fewer relationships than they came in with. And how do we create a reality where that's not true, or you don't exit with fewer relationships than you came in with? And part of how we do that is understand what relationships are there and then develop a plan to strengthen those relationships. The next is to explore options for youth to be placed with someone in their supportive network. Oftentimes, young people are not asked, do they have someone in their life that they would want to be living with? Yet when we asked young people things like this, oftentimes they did. Oftentimes they did have someone in their life that they wanted to be living with. And so how can we help ask young people this question, which can provide agency and empowerment, but then also provide potentially healthy, stable placement options for young people while in care and prevent them having to live with strangers or move outside of the community. And next is facilitate relationships by identifying opportunities for supportive adults to actually be helpful in young people's lives. So good examples of this is, you know, right now we have a system where it's the social worker's responsibility to make sure the young person applies for a job and is, you know, on track for graduation and is, you know, having what they need to get a driver's license. But all of these things are things we could actually bring in supportive adults to help do, which would not only, you know, give more capacity to social workers who are, you know, normally desperately in need of it, but it can also help strengthen relationships with supportive people over time. So if an uncle or a coach can help the young person write a resume, the young person doesn't just get the resume, they also have a stronger relationship with that coach or family member that then they can have, you know, for a long time and then can help them meet other goals even after they're out of care. Okay, so I'll stop us there and I'm going to invite my colleagues back in. And this is our last pillar before we move on to the panel discussion.
All righty. So Emily, Sarah F, want to kick it off?
Sure, I can kick it off. I mean, I think this was probably one of the biggest aha moments that we've had in this research, just like digging into what we knew was an important piece of success in aging out. Like there's plenty of research that tells us, you know, having supportive adults, having supportive community members as you age out of foster care can be such an indicator of success in life outcomes, whether that's housing, education, et cetera, et cetera. And so we really wanted to go into it and be like, well, where are the, like, why are youth alone? Who can they turn to for help? What does that look like? And it was like such an interesting thing to go through the journey of being kind of this team of researchers that is introduced by the agencies and the social workers, and then having youth completely be like, I have no one in my life. And we're like, well, what happens if you need X? What happens if you need like $100 to pay rent? Or what happens if you need, someone to drive you to this place? And then to start to see that like initial answer, we shouldn't have stopped at it, and then see where the layer of protection that youth added to the people in their life. And I think that was simply the biggest aha moment for me, not just in this research itself, but in a lot of research projects. So I'm really glad that we were able to get to that point, because otherwise we would have simply just like stopped and thought, okay, well, maybe what we should do is actually, pair youth with other people, or like introduce them to other people, rather than let's actually find out who are in their lives and let's reinforce those relationships. Let's nurture them. Let's make sure that they have the skills to be able to ask for help, have the skills to step in for help, et cetera, et cetera.
Emily, what resonated with you, or what was an aha moment that you had?
I think there's just understanding the system as it's set up, and the way that it assigns people roles in a youth's life as they grow up, and how if someone is assigned to help you and it's their job to help you, you should of course go to them before you ask anyone else. And how a lot of the ways that I've learned to trust people is by needing them and asking them for help, and them helping me, and them needing my help and me helping them. And so like having someone who is by their job supposed to support a youth is like in a sense like sort of breaking the path to trust, and how or building trust with others, and how I think it was helpful for me in understanding the way that I've built relationships in the past, and also seeing the way that you can't teach it directly, but you can foster it, you can take care of, you can like lead to it. And I think this one really feels like it. If there was like a 3-legged table of the 3 things we presented, like this is one of the legs. Like you can't just have this and not the other 2 things that we talked about. And if you have those other 2 things, I think this one would be much easier to support.
Thank you so much for that, Emily. This was probably the biggest aha moment that we had. When we started Think of Us, the idea was that how do we empower young people to activate their personal network, their personal supporters, the people that they cared about, and activate the paid professionals in their life to work together to support them. And what we learned was, because of this barrier of not being able to learn from the system that you're able to trust them, because we shouldn't, because everything that we've learned has told us not to trust the system with our personal network, that's one of the reasons why folks didn't even want to put the 2 groups of people on the same account, right? But what was very interesting is that as we were doing this research and participating, I found myself in my own aha moment, right? When I was 13 years old, I was couch surfing quite a bit. And so the way I was surviving was definitely through this network of friends' parents, and being able to go to friends' houses and being able to stay there. But when the system then re-entered me, never in my mind would I had even occurred to say to the system, oh, these are the folks who have helped me couch surf for 2 years. These are the folks who were there, because immediately my mind went to, are they going to get in trouble? There's something bad's going to happen. But even my supportive adults were like, don't bring those people here. Sometimes, because it was the perception of, the child welfare system has such a negative connotation that we didn't think of the system as they're here to help. The orientation I had was they continuously failed me, even though me and my supportive adults were making phone calls about abuse, right? And it took so much to prove that. And then on the second hand, it was, we literally didn't know the consequences, and I didn't want to be the risk of someone else losing their children because maybe 1 month they had too much, 1 month they didn't have enough food in their cabinets. And what would happen if a worker found that out, right? And so when it's you surviving and the people who are helping you are surviving, it becomes the scariest thing to expose them to the system in a way that it might risk everything that they have going on with their lives. And so when we were studying this, it was so interesting that for me, I couldn't even form the mental model that, hey, we might be hiding our supportive adults, because it had been ingrained in me from literally childhood that we just don't expose our people to the system. It's not a thing.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. And I'll also just add, something that we found is that for all sorts of other understandable reasons, young people, we found, even when they had these supportive relationships, sometimes didn't want to test those relationships or put weight on them for fear that they might break. This idea that so many relationships in their life had gone wrong, that they had one that was kind of stable and going right, let's say a coach, that I'll just let my coach be my coach and that's good. But if it turns out my coach could actually help me write a resume, and that would could be a good thing, I may not want to ask for fear that putting extra weight on the relationship could break it. And I would rather just keep that relationship untested and maybe a little bit more weak, rather than actually test it and say, hey, could you help me with my resume? And on the one hand, maybe the coach says yes, and then you get the help and you get a stronger relationship. Or on the other hand, the coach says no, and you feel a rejection or a weakening of the relationship. And we found that foster youth just didn't really want to do that exercise, which maintained the relationships at a certain state rather than ultimately allowing to strengthen them. And we saw that in this research because we actually wanted young people to help us talk to some of their supportive people, where we would pay the support person for participating in the interview, and we'd even pay the young person for arranging this interview. And we didn't have any young people that wanted to do that. None of them, even though they were willing to meet with us and receive our stipend and tell us their stories, they were not willing to introduce us to a supportive person in their life for fear that asking them to do something else might ultimately disrupt the relationship. So that was a really powerful learning from us too.
I'll add here that I want to be very clear too that this is a conditioning of the system. So when you have literally your livelihood, where you go to sleep at night, has been ripped away from you, literally taken from you because you didn't fit in enough with this family. You didn't follow enough of the new rules. You didn't abide by enough of the new cultural norms. You were too weird for the family, and you found yourself in another place, then this was the result of, this is how the system conditioning actually plays out. And so I want to make it very clear to everyone, it is not, the solution is not making trainings or making it better for young people or quote, increasing their personal resilience in order to achieve this goal. It's a systemic issue that has to be addressed. It is the conditions in which we live in, and it is not the burden of the young person to have to learn another huge thing because the system is doing something wrong. And so I just wanted to be very clear about that piece. Alrighty, we're gonna move on here.
Yes, thank you. So that brings us to the end of the findings and recommendations. We're gonna move now into a panel discussion, which Sixto is gonna lead us in. I'll just encourage you all that I see the Miro board actively moving. So if for folks who just joined late or want a refresher, we are offering folks the opportunity to do an in real life feedback. And you can also see how this human-centered design process works. So if you go to thinkofus.org/live, you'll actually see a link to Miro, or at the bottom, it'll say, click here to participate in synthesis. And this is totally, totally optional, but if you'd like to, you can click on that link and add in your insights into all of our findings and recommendations. And our design team, Sarah and Emily, are gonna be sorting those out as this panel discussion is going on. And then they're going to read out some of what you all have to say. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Sixto to lead us on the panel. And thanks so much for listening to the findings and recommendations.
Oh, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off there, Sarah. Still learning the new software. So I am so pleased to invite folks to this panel. And this panel is basically a reactions panel. And so we just had individuals who heard this content for the first time. And each of the folks that you hear on here are going to be folks who are in different, who have lived experience, but are in different roles. And so we're just going to have a reaction video here. And so I'll have everyone introduce themselves, and please note we're probably working with audio as we're streaming to many different places here. So Jessica, would you like to kick us off here?
Sure. Do I sound okay?
You sound great.
Perfect. If I start sounding like a robot, just let me know. So I'm Jessica Rogers. I'm the Executive Director for Connections to Independence, C2I. We are based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we were lucky and honored to be one of the sites that got to work with Think of Us during this project. So this was amazing watching all of this information come to fruition. And we work with young adults and teens, 14 up to their 25th birthday, who are in and aging out of the foster care system. And it's a holistic approach. So all of this information was super exciting to hear what's happening out there.
Awesome. And Amani?
Hey everyone, my name is Amani Meyers, and I would say I'm originally from Boston, Massachusetts, but I am currently in Sacramento, California. And I am currently a resource family specialist trainer. I'm actually hearing myself in the background.
You sound good here.
Okay, awesome. Maybe it's just my side, but yeah, I'm a resource training specialist for resource families and caregivers and those who are interested in adopting. And my role is to help them get through that process. I have lived experience. I grew up in the foster care system in Boston, Massachusetts, and have done a lot of work on advocacy. And my work ranges from helping create policies on Capitol Hill to the White House to just being able to use my experiences to, help fuel change. So I'm really excited and happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you, Amani. And there are fans, as you can see in the chat, people are shouting you out. There's love coming your way. And then Courtney, if we can get your camera just a little bit higher so we can see you here, as the software is cutting you there real quick. And then feel free to introduce yourself. Can we hear you here, Courtney?
Uh-oh.
Right. So what we're going to do is improvise a bit. I want to get started with the first question, Courtney. If we can't get connected with audio, we'd love to still have you on camera. And what we can do is write in the chat just any reactions, and we'll continuously shout them out as we get everyone going here. So with that being said, the first thing I wanted to ask folks was any kind of gut reaction, something that stood out to you, an insight that you were like, wow, we as a field have not spent enough time talking about this thing. So just wanted to pose that to the group.
Yeah, I think my gut reaction to this was, it was really helpful to, hear all of this information and to just get an idea and a perspective of sort of where young people have been at. And while we have, sort of focused, where the system sort of lacks, I would say that I think it's really important to also talk about how the foster care system was created and how the racial impact, racial component to it has also left an impact on our young people. I was a product of the crack epidemic. And so I was, born from that. And so grew up in the system around that. And, you can't help but wonder to know how the system and sort of its creation, that was something that was supposed to be temporary, has become a permanent fixture. But at the same time, it has not really address the historical aspects to the system. And I think that if we can't talk from that perspective, I think that some of this stuff is lost. And I think it's important to do that, especially during this time where so many of us are now, seeing, the implications of policing and policies, and how our young people don't just come from the child welfare system, but they interact with many other systems. And so how all of that is also fueled and impacted when you talk about the young. And then the other thing too is to talk about it from, a generational perspective and an approach, that you're not just necessarily working with the child, but you're also working with the family. At the end of the day, the purpose of the goal of foster care is to reunify. And so my thing is that we have to really get to that place and really speak from that point, especially because, many of these young people are going to age out and sort of, get reshuffled, through the system. And so I think what was really helpful was to hear the feedback from the young people themselves. I think that the approach that I really appreciated was to really dig deep into dissect not just what, a systems perspective is saying, but what our young people are saying. And I think that if we begin to create our policies around that, I think that that's going to be a really good start.
Thank you so much, Amani. I really appreciate that reflection. Just before we go to Jessica here, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and have Courtney still participate. But the way we're going to have her participate is that we are going to go ahead and have her participate in the chat, and then we'll continuously loop in her voice. Unfortunately, her audio couldn't work with us today here. So Jessica, what are your reactions?
Yeah, I wasn't surprised at all by the 3 different areas that were pulled out from the conversations and all of different research you guys did over the last year. I think what needs to happen is that we can't blame the system. We can't depend on the system, if you will, to provide these resources for our young people. I am honored and blessed that we are a standalone nonprofit working in partnership with Hennepin County. But those social workers already have so much on their plates that in order to do, the healing and dealing of trauma and the youth-centered plans and building those supportive networks, that's realistically not going to happen. And, we do all of that because I was writing down all of these different things as you guys were pointing out, that I want to actually write a paper and respond to what C2I is doing here in each one of those areas. Because someone typed in the chat, where are some more resources? Where do we have shared resources? It's not like these things aren't happening, but we don't have one collective place, not even in Minnesota, and on a national level is even harder to find resources to make these things happen. C2I is focused on a strength-based, youth-centered approach of a healthy mind, body, spirit to the work of our kids healing through their journey through C2I, through foster care, so they're thriving once they leave here. So we're doing all of these things and would just love to be able to share on another level with everyone who's on this call today. I wish I could see people to see where people were from and what different people do. But I think the biggest thing is sharing of resources, not depending on the states and the counties to provide these services, but how can we collectively, as us here on this call, come together and build something or provide resources to share out with other folks across the country to do this work.
Thank you, Jessica. I think that, really hits on one of the core things that we saw in the last piece, in the last pillar here, which was what is it going to actually take to activate our supportive adults, right? And so as you heard the material, what is one thing that stood out to you that you're like, wow, I need to go back home and make sure that we double down on this piece here? Is there anything that stood out to you in that regard?
Yeah, so right before so as we've been doing this work, C2I 2020 was our 10-year anniversary. Great year to have a 10-year anniversary. But we realized that we were failing our kids, right? We're very transparent saying, hey, you want to know what, when they're aging out and they need something, they're still coming back to C2I, us as paid people in their lives. We develop a familial culture, which is fine. But realistically, they're not coming to my house for Christmas. They're not coming to my house for Thanksgiving. I'm not going out with them every year when it's their birthday for all, 400 kids that we've worked with over the years. So what do we need to do? How did I fail them? So we actually took the YTC model, the Youth Transition Conference model, which starts at 16 and a half, 17 in Hennepin County, but the youth transition at 18, and then those YTCs don't typically happen once they're in extended foster care. So what we decided to do is take these, what we call circle of support meetings, and do them quarterly, starting with that when that young person first comes into the Connections to Independence. So finding out who are these supportive people in your life, and then continuing those on, and they're youth-led, first of all. So their counselor meets with them a week prior saying, hey, what are your goals? What do you want to talk about in this meeting? And I'll help you facilitate with the goal that once they get older, they're the ones who are facilitating those. They've seen different people come through their circle of support. It may be they need someone to support them in high school, and then it's post-secondary. So they're learning how to develop these healthy relationships, but also see the transition. Like, this person may not be in your life for the rest of your life, and they may just serve a purpose at that time. But then there are people at the end of this transition that will be unpaid people that will be there for long-term in their lives. So this is one of the things that we want to get back to, because the pandemic hit and it was so hard to coordinate that. I mean, with trying to coordinate everything online, and then coordinate 5 or 6 different schedules to do these for 78 different children and young people, that just was not possible. So that's one thing that I'm going to take away that I need to get back to make sure that our young people are supported long-term and get back to that piece.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for that. And Amani, anything that you heard that, again, that you felt like, wow, wasn't something that we typically hear, and how might we start to think differently about a specific piece of what you just heard? Any other reactions here?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of great content and just a lot of great information. And I really appreciated just hearing the aspect of, bolstering the youth support. I think that, especially when I think back on my life, it wasn't necessarily social workers who were supportive, who were able to sort of get me to where I needed to go, again, because they're, they're understaffed and they're overworked. And it was teachers, it was mentors, it was people in my church, it was all sorts of different people that sort of came together to sort of support me. And so I think for me, what I find that is really necessary is around, having, those stable relationships, and sort of recognizing that not every young person, I thought it was really interesting that more young people, when they enter into the system, they leave with less people than they know. And I think that part of that stems from this mentality that the system doesn't really understand that when young people come into care, that there may have been already protective factors in place. They were already resilient beforehand, and they already had family members. The family members may not have been, quote unquote, the right fit, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't have that. And so for me, I find that I think it's also super important to, figure out how do we also not just support, the caregivers around supporting, family transitions and all of that stuff, but how do we also include birth families? And I think that part of the process is that when young people enter into care, birth parents are just removed from the whole process. And so thinking back to, again, my life and not even knowing what exactly happened when I went into foster care, it was sort of this notion that my mom was this or my mom was that. And then talking to my mom, she wasn't receiving the supports that, that she needed. And so in my work now as a resource family trainer, it's really about having these people that are coming forward to recognize that we're still trying to preserve the family system and that you are here as a resource. And so I think that part of it is that within the system, and and not just within the system, but among nonprofits and all sorts of things, is that there's often this competitive side, and we tend to forget, who's at the center of this. And so how do we effectively collaborate to make sure that the young person is actually at the center of this work? And how do we lift that load off of social workers to also say that, that there are teachers, that there are mentors, that there are coaches, that there are, even siblings that can also, help continue to build on those protective factors. And so I think it's just important for young people to know that, that they are, and we are are resilient already. And that the fact that, we may have had some situations that came up into our lives, it doesn't take away from us being as whole people. And so I think that really just stressing the need for, therapeutic services right when you enter into care, as well as, health and well-being, all of those things. And then last but not least, letting young people know that healing is a lifelong journey, that there are things that you don't just experience as a child, you're going to experience things all throughout your life. And so how do you have the tools to really be able to help support you through that process? Because even for me, I mean, I've aged out, I'm 32, but I still need support. I still need resources. I still need all sorts of things. And so for me, one of the things that I have been really appreciative of is that I have been able to develop my own network of support. And so for me, if I do need something or I need someone, I have someone that I can call. And so I think it's about also letting young people know that they are the agents of their own story. They're the agents of their own experience. And that in order to also create the life that they want, they also have to have, committed and dedicated people in their lives to help them get there.
Amani, well said. Well said. I want to encourage folks on the chat right now. If there's something that you feel like we should be centering around healing, youth identified preparedness, activating support of adults, I want you to name whatever theme, whatever idea that you think should be at the center of new systems as the system pivots. I want you to put that in the chat right there. And I know some folks asked about Jessica's organization. I dropped the link in there so you can go ahead and visit. And then I also want to give Courtney, she'll be jumping on the chat soon to give her a moment to kind of express in writing what her thoughts are there. But Jessica, any reactions? I see you leaning in.
Yeah. Amani, what you said, I'm just like, yes, like I said before, like that's the focus of C2I, is having youth at the center of everything that we do and how we do it. They even help hire our counselors, strategic planning, the activities we do, everything. But on top of that, we have 5 core areas that we focus on: education, housing, employment, financial literacy, and personal wellness. We spend all summer just focusing on those things. Because when you build a circle of support, they have to identify first what is healthy mind, body, and soul for self, and then teaching them how to identify that in others in their circle of support. So yeah, they could have people and bio family, because those are just as is people in their lives that we actually kind of negate and dismiss once they come into foster care. But how do we bring those important people in their lives, but teach our young people how to understand boundaries with their bio family and know what's healthy to have in their lives, right? And that's up to us to find those resources. We're blessed here in Minneapolis with our organization that we partner with a licensed marriage and family therapist clinic that is Black owned, because 98% of the kids we work with are BIPOC youth, right? And so we also, not only the services that we provide, sorry, the chat's popping up in the middle of my screen here, but we try to bring in people who look like our kids, who have experience like our young people, and are actually on a process right now of how do we intentionally give our young people the training, the healing, and the leadership skills so they can come and be staff at C2I. Our last hire actually was an alumni of our organization. Now we're trying to figure out how to do that intentionally, but understand that we're watching her, that she's still experiencing trauma as she's going through and being a counselor. So what do we need to do to make sure, healing trauma is lifelong learning, because there's different triggers at different points in your life, and you remember different things. Like Sixto, you were just saying something reminded you of, a situation when you were younger and in the system. And so giving our young people the tools and the resources and the support to go through that process and go through that journey. But again, we have to make sure the young person, and it's strength-based, we're not picking at the things that they're bad at or they don't do well. Let's focus on what you do well and build you up in that. And I don't know if any of you have heard of Search Institute. It's based here in Minnesota, but they're an international organization, research organization. But they've got an excellent curriculum called Sparks that we use, and 40 developmental assets of adolescence that you may be more familiar with. But we really focus on, we were trained in that because they wanted to take that training and refocus it on how do we utilize this for youth who are in foster care, because that was built for kids who are in communities. But I would really highly recommend doing the Sparks curriculum and getting the Sparks book, because it's really finding out what are you passionate, what are you excited about in life, and then really building from there. And then also types of dreams, goals, and education pathways, career pathways really stem from taking them through that process. So like I said, I could probably talk about this for like 2 hours. I'm really excited about all this stuff. So I will stop there. But yeah.
Thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate that. So in this next section, I'm so excited. I'm going to bring onto the stage with us Sarah F. But before I do that, just want to name that Courtney really just highlighted that. She said, there is no healing, preparedness, or building a social network unless youth are centered, unless youth are given space to share without repercussion. And I can't agree more with what we just heard from Courtney, from so many in the thread. And I'm going to go ahead and bring Sarah F. on to share the Miro board. So at the beginning of this, we shared this digital whiteboard, and many of you have been busy in it. Many of you have also been giving tons of comments. I want to make space for both of those things to happen. Super excited here. So I'm going to bring on Sarah F. Sarah, thanks for joining us here, and excited to share your screen and share a little bit of what you're seeing here. And I'm going to keep the panelists on camera too.
This sounds great. Thank you so much, Sixto. And thanks everybody who was just being busy bees, adding their reactions and comments to the Miro board. So as we were reviewing a lot of them, I'm going to hide the cursors here because they're a little distracting. There were 3 themes that stood out to us from people's reactions and comments. The first one is just how limiting the system is and how it hinders youth agency. And I think we saw that in a couple of ways where how limiting the options the system offers to deal with trauma and mental health are. I think we are seeing people describe how even though they've had trauma explained to them a number of times, when they're pushing for certain modalities, they're being met, that medication really sucks, that teens are forced to use medication, et cetera, et cetera. The limitations of the system also come into play when we're talking about the options for building a future that are presented to youth. So for example, they may be discouraged if they're talking about wanting to be a social worker. The system doesn't necessarily strive for greatness or think that youth can strive for greatness, et cetera, et cetera. Another theme that we saw here is, and we saw that in the chat as well quite a bit, is the need to provide youth with safe opportunities to fail. I think one of the most important developmental milestones that all adolescents and youth have to go through is this idea that you make mistakes, because all of us make mistakes. But how do you learn from those mistakes and move forward in a healthy way that doesn't punish you if you have to react to something in a way that feels normal or natural to you? And then the last piece is, we've talked about this quite a bit, is the importance to center youth in any and all decisions. We're talking about asking youth what are some of the ways that they want to heal from trauma, asking youth what are some of the ways that they would feel prepared as they grow up and want to become adults, asking youth who are the people in their lives and how we can best support them in asking for help and in nurturing relationships. So those are some of the themes that we saw. As you can see, I'm still in the middle of organizing some of these, but I would love to hear what the panelists think about these 3 themes.
I will say that it's a little hard to see, so it's hard for me to.
I can't see it at all. Can you restate the themes? Because
yeah,
bifocals, I'm still blind.
No worries. I will actually type them up. So it's how limiting the system is and how it hinders youth agency, the need to provide youth with safe opportunities to fail, and the importance of centering youth in all decisions. Can you see these?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. I agree that the Post-its are a little harder to see.
Yeah, so I can speak more to, so the need to provide youth with safe opportunities to fail. Now, that's something we always do. We are not going to catch our kids. They've received, they come to us at 14, have typically been with us about average 3 years before they age out at 21 of the county, but then they stay with us until their 25th birthday. But we like our young people to fall while they're with us so they can learn from those mistakes. We can say, okay, here's the resources. And what have you learned from this? Like we as it hurts us and pains us to watch them. It's like watching your own kid fail and you just want to be like, no, don't fall. I can catch you. But then if I do, you're not going to learn from that. But this is a safe space for them to do that. And I don't know I don't know what's happening in other organizations or in other states or other counties, but are there people to really help them get up from that once they fall? I've seen that a couple times in the chat too, like natural consequences are the best, but who's really there to support them to make sure that, some of these natural consequences can be deadly if you don't have the right support for our young people who are aging out of the system. So I just like to say that.
Thank you, Jessica. And I just want to remind folks, like, where these 3 themes just came from, were literally from you all. So as you all have been commenting, as you all have been in the Miro boards, our senior UX researchers, user experience researchers were in the background grouping those themes together. And these are the 3 themes that ended up showing up as a result of that. And so how limiting the system is and how it hinders youth agency, adolescence is the phase where neurologically it is set aside so that you are learning how to become an independent emerging adult that then becomes the young adult and then the older adult, right? And so this is going back to what Amani said earlier, which is we inherited a system that its legislation is primarily focused on the safety and keeping young people alive in terms of toddlers alive versus actual adolescent development. We never intended for adolescents to spend this much time in a system that it would require the state to take on the responsibility to figure out how is it that you're providing the appropriate experiences that lead to healing, to development, and really position young people to thrive. Sarah F., that's amazing that you were able to gather so many comments. I'm pretty sure there's over 100 comments, and be able to group them so quickly so that people are able to see those. Amani, any quick reaction to these 3 themes here?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out something that was said in the chat by my good friend Tony Parsons. But he talked about, again, having a racial equity framework. And I say that because one of the themes that comes up is about giving young people safe opportunities to fail. I think the problem is that we also live in a society where it's very punitive. And so if you live in a society that's very punitive, it's going to sort of drastically sort of showcase how we then treat people. And I think when it comes down to, again, people of color, those things can become more harsher. And so for me, I do think that it's about, again, having people that understand the neurological development of young people. I think about, I was a senior in high school and I was on my last suspension and got caught drawing graffiti on the wall. And it was a new principal there at the school. And I ran away from the new teacher, ended up being brought up by school police, and sat down in the office. And I will never forget my principal saying this to me. And, they said, "What do you like to do besides drawing graffiti on the wall? Like, who are you?" And they wanted to get to know who I was behind my behavior, and taking that opportunity to sort of see that I was a student that fell through the cracks, and decided to put extra measures in place to help me, thrive. And so I just interviewed with her a couple of weeks ago for my book, and I asked her, what was it that led you to want to invest in someone like myself? And, she said that I saw that you were a student that fell between the cracks. And it's not that I still didn't have to do community service. Like, I still had to scrub the walls after school, but she ended up giving me a job to help me stay out of trouble, because she also understood that not only was there a need for me to, stay engaged, but she also understood the component of being a teenager in foster care that didn't have a job and wanted to support me in that way. And so she's still in my life today. And this is, beyond 10 years. And so I really think that is super, super important to, provide opportunities for young people to fail, but to also then describe what does that actually mean? Because failure, I feel like, is just pretty subjective. You can't really, measure that. But I think that it's really important for young people to at least know that if at any point, something happens, that there's somebody that has their back. And I think that is crucially important.
Amani, can I just say one thing real quick, Sixto? I think what Amani said is really important, because I was just thinking about, we keep saying the word system, the system, the system, but the system is made up of people, and the people who work in that system have different mindsets, or they're engulfed by the culture of the system. And if we could take that one person that Amani is talking about and find out, why did you even ask that question? Where did that come from? Most people, that just comes from like an innate place. But how do we retrain these folks who are working on the front lines with our young people, who typically don't look like our young people, don't come from their neighborhoods? I think that's where a lot of change needs to happen as well, is how do we retrain, or actually just train people on like compassion and human, and being a human person, I think that's really important, what needs to happen if we're looking at changing the system, because the system is made up of just people.
And then to quickly add to that, also changing the environment, making sure the environment is safe, and so I can imagine that the work that you're doing, Jessica, is that you all have that, in mind. It's not just, coming into a school office, but going into a DCF office, how comfortable is it for people to come in and to know that they're valued? I think at the end of the day, young people need to know that no matter what, they have worth, dignity, and value. And then those things should be really assessed in, how we make the environment welcoming, how like you said, how staff are trained. I mean, these are all
creating a whole culture. A whole culture.
It needs to be a whole cultural shift.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that follows what Courtney just put in the chat here, that she said, look, we cannot continue to keep engineering youth and families to be dependent on a system, right? And to be conditioned, and I'm going to add in there, and being conditioned by one. And then she goes on to say, or suffer the multi-generational impacts. So she echoes Amani in that older youth need to be able to heal and have the skills to be able to navigate to adulthood. So we are closing out here in just a couple minutes here. I'm going to go ahead and do one more round of final thoughts with every single one of you here. I cannot say enough how thankful I am to our participants for being so active in the chat. I mean, look at these 3 themes that you all have bubbled up from your commentary. Sarah F., you are amazing to be able to synthesize all of that as we go. So I would love just to hear from every single one of our panelists, and Sarah F., like, what are some thoughts here? And before I do that, I just want to highlight Courtney's comment here where she says, look, failure shouldn't equal placement disruption. It shouldn't equal being medicated or placed in a group home. Failure should equal opportunity to identify how to cope with ambiguity. I have to say, that's deep. That's real deep, because that is what that is what the adolescenthood is all about. When we look at the neuroscience, it's about healthy risk taking. It's about learning, and you can't have learning without being able to try something, get back up again, and do it again. Thank you so much, Courtney, for your thoughts there. I would like to pass it over to Amani.
Sorry, chats were like piling up and I was trying to get off mute. But speaking to what Courtney said, it is so true. And I just think that, understanding that our young people, again, I know that many of us were, born into conditions that we did not anticipate, things that we did not want, and things that we didn't hope for. But it's also to say that we also came with this inner resilience. We came with this inner strength, and we have the ability to continue to rock the boat. I think that especially for our young people who have been pouring into the chats, this is just an example of where we're heading. And I think that we're on a road that is really going to be a good one, and one that just helps each of us to challenge our own beliefs, our own thinking about what does it mean to be someone in foster care. And so I just think that the last thing that I can say is, like, again, that healing is a lifelong journey. that each of us have experienced traumatic experiences, and we've also experienced some good things in our lives, and some of us may have not. But I think it's just to remember that there's a community of us that are here together that are really trying to help spearhead an organization and spearhead a better child welfare system. And I think that if we just continue to re-envision and reimagine, we'll get there. And so I just want to thank you all for having me on.
The honor is ours, truly, Amani. Really honored. Jessica, would you like to go next?
Yeah, first I just want to say thank you, Sixto, for everything that you're doing. I mean, even during the pandemic, you were leading so many different initiatives and, getting people together nationally. So I really appreciate that. I really think, kind of to piggyback on Amani, we need to honor, respect, the knowledge and the experience of our young people. They know what they want. They know what their dreams are. They know what their goals are, and to really keep them at the center of this work. And we really need to, if the system's pushing back, find another way to do it. I was at one point where I was like, I don't know if Hennepin County is going to fund us again. There was lots of different things going on. I was like, okay, I need to figure out how I'm going to do this outside of the system. Like, we want our young people not to be dependent on these different systems that they get put into. We as workers cannot be dependent on the government, on counties. We need to figure this out and come together. We've got enough, and it shows on this call right here, we've got enough power, we've got enough resources, we've got enough knowledge to really figure out how we can really come up with a model of how to help these kids and families on a national level. So thank you again for letting me be here. And I have to jump off right now to take my son to basketball practice. But thank you, and I'm sure I'll talk to you very soon.
Thank you, Jessica. The honor is ours. Thank you so much, and thank you for the work you're doing. And thank you to your staff who've just been killing it. Sarah, would love to hear any final thoughts from you.
No final thoughts other than the fact that this has been the honor of a career to be able to partake in this work. I think that as we are in a phase of our nation's history where we're thinking about specifically the structural conditions that are stacked against certain groups of people, and the legacy of a lot of the systems and structures that we have, and like the racist and oppressive histories that they carry with them. I am very hopeful that we fold some of these conversations around child welfare and the reckoning that it has to do, and the future that it needs to reimagine for itself as part of this larger national conversation. So I'm excited to see what comes out of that.
The honor is truly mine. Thank you for being on this project. Thank you for centering young people at every single aspect of the way, from the design of the research to the synthesizing of the research to participating on the research team to the reporting out of this research. So thank you so much to you, and also to Sarah Sullivan and Emily and all of the research team that has done so much to make sure that youth were centered and engaged and integrated into the process. And I'll say, not only am I talking about y'all being centered, not only were young people engaged and centered, but it was also lived experience. People who were in foster care before, who participated in this and were able to contribute there. So with that being said, I'm going to have our final words here from Sarah Sullivan, who just did an amazing job leading the project along with Emily and our partners to do that. And a special shout out and thank you to folks who were on the ground, and I won't name names because I don't want to get in trouble. So you can read them on the website, but you know who you are. You are the 5 sites who made this possible. To every young person, every lived experience person, every advocate who, authentically shared with us so that we can make this moment happen. Thank you. And I want to pass it to Sarah now.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sixto. And thank you, everybody. I just wanted to share briefly, what is Think of Us doing with this and what's next for us. We embarked on this not to do a research project, certainly not an academic one. We embarked on this because Think of Us is a systems change organization, and we wanted to know, where should we put our efforts and where should we spend our time to have the most maximum impact? And we came up with these 3 pillars to answer our own questions to that. But in doing that, we felt like we stumbled on some information that other people might like to know, and that's why we wanted to share it with you today. But this, for us, isn't the end. This is the beginning. This is the answer to our question. And so what are we doing with it? Well, we're having these 3 pillars shape everything that we do. And we're actually in the process right now of helping a state agency design its adolescent programs around these 3 pillars. And they're even organizing their whole structure around these 3 pillars. So for us, this is just the beginning. This is what the work's going to look like for us, is saying these are the 3 pillars that we're building on in everything that Think of Us does. And what are we asking of you? Well, if you found this interesting, this presentation is really just the beginning. We'd encourage you to take a look at the full report, which you can find on the Think of Us website, thinkofus.org/aged-out report. Sixto can maybe share the link, and you can dig in further into all the findings. What you can see is that really this information gets at shifting some of our deepest mental models about how child welfare works. So the first best thing that you can do is just start having conversations about these things within your youth boards, within your state agencies, within your foundations, and talk about how we can actually be shifting our mental models around these topics. And then another thing I'll say, and specifically, should we have anyone on the call that works around trauma, is that we're seeing a really surge in national interest in writing in the medical literature and other kinds of bodies around trauma and how to heal it. And a lot of this focuses on important communities like veterans and people who've experienced sexual assault, and that is all huge. I'd also really encourage you to start looking at foster care and how we can make sure that foster youth and child welfare are among the first to benefit from emerging research around how we can heal folks from trauma. So if that's something that you work on, I would encourage you to really think about that. And of course, as always, have these recommendations inform how you're running programs and also how we're informing policy. Think of Us will be here with you in that journey all along the way. You can reach out to us on our website or to me with Sarah with an H at thinkofus.org. We'll share that email. And we are recording today's event and we'll be putting it up on our website, so you'll be able to share it or watch it again. And we just want to thank you so much for your participation, for doing this new idea, which is doing this live human-centered design meeting with 200 people at the same time, which is pretty awesome. And just thank you for all that you do, whether you're a foster youth or someone who works in child welfare, for committing to making a better system and thinking about things a little bit differently. And of course, our time is the most valuable thing right now. So thanks for spending 2 hours with us to hear what we found about how we can improve lives for transition age youth.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you for leading the teams to make this happen. Thank you to Bloom. Thank you to the sites, to every person with lived experience, every expert who was a part of this this process to get to this end result. I am so grateful and honored to have been able to literally get these beautiful insights from each of you. With that being said, I'm going to keep this chat open for the next couple of minutes. And what I'm going to ask folks while we have you is, like, what went well? What improvement would you like to see? This is a new platform. This is a new way of engaging. We're trying to just show up and just be able to just authentically be here. And we want to know what resonated with you so that in the future we could go ahead and improve our process. So this is real time. Feel free to give us a few things here. Sarah has put her contact information in the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, no matter how small, no matter how big, no matter if you are running a program, whether you are a young person in care, a young person who's aged out, it doesn't matter who will go ahead and respond. So thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you soon.